We didn't go to the cabin looking for anything strange. It wasn't remote in a dramatic way. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't advertised as isolated or dangerous. It was just available. At first, nothing felt wrong. The lights worked, the water ran, the rooms were clean. Everything functioned the way it was supposed to. And that was the problem. Because the longer we stayed, the more it felt like the cabin wasn't reacting to us at all. Not to our presence, not to our routines, not to the fact that people were living inside it. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't haunted. It just kept working. And by the time we realized what that meant, leaving didn't feel like an ending. It felt like we had never been part of it to begin with. We chose the cabin because it was supposed to be quiet, not scenic, not remote, just quiet enough to feel empty. The listing mentioned it had been unused for months, off-season, no recent bookings, the kind of place that sat untouched while people forgot it existed. That was exactly what we wanted, somewhere neutral, somewhere that didn't carry anyone else's presence. The drive there felt ordinary, a narrow road cutting through trees that thinned as we climbed. No signs, no gates, just a small gravel turnout and a wooden cabin set back far enough to feel separate, but not isolated. It looked exactly like the photos. Same porch, same faded siding, same wide front windows that reflected the trees instead of revealing anything inside. Nothing felt misleading, nothing felt hidden. The door was locked. The key was in the lockbox. The code worked on the first try. Everything checked out. Inside, the first thing I noticed was what wasn't there. No smell. Cabins that sit empty usually carry something with them. Damp wood, old air, that stale, closed-up feeling that hits you the moment you open the door. This one didn't have any of that. It didn't smell cleaned. It didn't smell fresh. It smelled neutral, like air that had already been moved around. The floorboards were clean, not shiny, just clean enough that dust hadn't settled into the corners. The couch cushions were straightened, aligned carefully, not fluffed for guests, but pressed into place the way people do when they're finished using something. The kitchen felt the same way. Dishes stacked neatly, cabinets closed evenly, no water spots in the sink, no paper towels left out. Everything was already where it was supposed to be. It didn't feel abandoned, it felt paused. We set our bags down near the door. That's when I noticed the boots. They were on the rack against the wall, lined up neatly, worn but clean. Not decorative, not hiking boots meant to be seen, just boots, the kind someone actually wore. They weren't ours. Probably the owner's, my friend said without looking at them too closely. That explanation worked too easily. I didn't question it. Owners left things behind all the time. Spare supplies, old gear. Nothing about the boots was threatening. Still, I didn't move them. We unpacked slowly, moving through the space the way people do when they don't want to disturb anything. The bedroom was already made, sheets tucked tight, the blanket folded halfway down, like someone had expected to return later and pull it up again. I pressed my hand against the mattress. It wasn't cold. That was when the feeling started. Not fear, not concern, just a faint awareness that the cabin hadn't been waiting for us to arrive. It had already been ready. As the afternoon slipped toward evening, the light outside changed. The trees blocked the sky more than they had on the drive in. Shadows settled faster than I expected. Right as the sun dropped behind the ridge, the porch light turned on. Neither of us touched the switch. I stood there for a moment, watching it, waiting for it to flicker, waiting for it to shut off again. It stayed on. Timer, my friend said. Another explanation that made sense. Another reason not to think too hard about it. We made a simple dinner, ate quietly. The cabin stayed warm even though we hadn't turned the heater on. The floor didn't creak the way old cabins usually do. When we moved, the sounds were muted, dull, like the wood had already adjusted to wait. Later, I noticed the fireplace. We hadn't used it. No firewood stacked nearby. But inside, there was ash. Fine and gray. Not enough to smell like smoke, just enough to show it hadn't been sitting untouched for months. I didn't say anything, neither did my friend. That was the strange part. We were both noticing the same things, but neither of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud, as if speaking it would turn the feeling into something more solid. Night settled in fully. The cabin didn't make noise. No animals, no wind against the walls, no branches scraping the windows. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt organized. The lights stayed steady. The temperature didn't change. The space functioned smoothly, like it already had a rhythm, and we were simply moving within it. At one point, my friend looked up and said quietly, "It doesn't feel empty." I knew exactly what they meant. Not like someone was hiding, not like someone was watching. More like we had arrived between uses, between routines. We went to bed without discussing it further. The cabin stayed exactly as it was. I woke up before my alarm. Nothing had disturbed my sleep. No noise, no movement, no sense of panic. Still, my body felt alert in a way I couldn't explain, like I'd been awake longer than I realized. Morning light filtered through the front windows, pale and thin. The cabin looked exactly the same as it had the night before, clean, still, undisturbed. The floor wasn't cold. That was the first thing I noticed when I stood up. Cabins usually cooled down overnight, especially ones surrounded by trees. This one felt unchanged, like the temperature had been held in place. I told myself it was insulation, or good construction, another explanation that didn't require more thought. In the kitchen, the coffee maker was already plugged in. I was almost certain it hadn't been. Not unplugged, not moved, just ready, sitting exactly where it should be. My friend noticed it too. I could tell by the way they paused, hand hovering for a moment before filling it with water. But they didn't say anything. Neither did I. We moved around each other carefully, quietly, like guests sharing a space that wasn't fully ours. While packing, I opened a cabinet we hadn't used yet. Inside were cleaning supplies, normal ones, but they were arranged deliberately, bottles aligned by height, labels facing forward. Someone maintained this space. The guest binder sat on the counter, open to the rules page. We hadn't opened it. The page wasn't creased or marked, just open, as if it had been left that way intentionally. We ate breakfast without conversation. The decision to leave early didn't feel like a reaction. It felt like a continuation, like the next step in something already in motion. Before loading the car, I walked through the cabin one last time. Everything was where it belonged. The fireplace looked untouched, but the ash inside was the same fine layer I'd noticed the night before. Not old, not fresh, just present. The boots were still on the rack, lined up neatly, toes facing outward, ready to be stepped into. I hesitated, then moved one of them. Just slightly, an inch at most. It felt childish, but I wanted to see something break the pattern. We stepped outside to load the car. The air was colder than inside the cabin, sharper, real. When we came back 5 minutes later to grab the last bag, the boot was back in place, perfectly aligned with the other. I stared at it longer than I should have. There were no new marks on the floor, no scuffs, no sound that explained how it had happened, just corrected. We locked the door and drove away. The cabin disappeared quickly as the road curved downhill. The trees closed around it without noise, like nothing had been interrupted. Halfway home, my phone buzzed. An automated message from the rental service. "Thank you for staying with us. We hope you enjoyed your visit." The timestamp showed it had been sent 30 minutes earlier. We hadn't checked out yet. I didn't reply. Later that day, I tried to understand what had unsettled me. Nothing followed us. Nothing confronted us. Nothing tried to scare us away. That was the problem. The cabin hadn't reacted to us like a place being disturbed. It had reacted like a place being resumed, like we had arrived during a pause, and leaving simply allowed it to continue. We didn't rush when we left. There was no urgency, no argument, no moment where we admitted something was wrong. We moved through the cabin slowly, the way people do when they're trying not to disturb a place that feels settled. Breakfast dishes were washed and dried. The trash was tied off and set by the door. The bed was made again, the blanket folded back into the same position it had been in when we arrived. Nothing felt unfinished. I noticed how careful we were being, not because we had agreed to it, but because it felt necessary, like the cabin expected things to be returned the way they were found. Before leaving, I walked through each room one last time. The living area was unchanged. The kitchen counters were clear. The bathroom light was off. The mirror wiped clean. Every space looked neutral again, ready for whoever came next, or whatever. The boots were still by the door. I didn't touch them this time. We stepped onto the porch, locked the door, and set the key back in the lockbox. The cabin sat quietly behind us, unchanged by our presence. No sound came from inside, no shift in the air. It didn't react to us leaving. That was what stayed with me. On the drive down, the road felt shorter. The trees thinned sooner than I expected. Within minutes, the cabin was gone from view, hidden completely, as if it had never been there at all. Neither of us spoke until we were well past the turnoff. Finally, my friend said, "It felt like borrowing something that wasn't meant to be shared." I didn't answer right away, because that was exactly it. We hadn't been unwelcome. We hadn't been watched. We hadn't been threatened. We had simply occupied space that already belonged to something else. Later, when I thought about the cabin, I realized something that unsettled me more than any of the details. It never resisted us. It didn't push us away when we arrived. It didn't react when we stayed. It didn't change when we left. It behaved like a place that already knew its rhythm would continue, like we were never meant to interrupt it. We didn't cancel the booking. We didn't complain. We didn't leave a review explaining why we cut the trip short. There was nothing to explain. The cabin had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It remained ready, and whatever had been paused before we arrived felt free to continue once we were gone. We booked the cabin for 5 nights, long enough to stop paying attention to small details, long enough to settle into a routine and let the place feel normal. That was the appeal. The listing described it as simple, quiet, and practical, a place meant to be used, not admired. The owner's messages were short and efficient. Check-in instructions, Wi-Fi password, a reminder to lock up when we left. Nothing unusual. When we arrived, the cabin felt familiar almost immediately. 2 bedrooms, a compact kitchen, a narrow hallway that connected everything together. It wasn't large enough to get lost in, and it didn't feel old. Everything worked the way it should. We started unpacking without thinking much about the layout. That was when I noticed the door at the end of the hallway. It looked like every other interior door in the cabin. Same color, same handle, same height. If I hadn't been carrying a bag, I probably would have walked past it without registering it at all. The only difference was the lock. It was newer than the rest. The metal was clean, unmarked, and slightly brighter than the hinges on the other doors. It wasn't broken or reinforced, just replaced. Recently. Storage, probably, my friend said when I pointed it out. That made sense. Cabins always had storage rooms, extra supplies, owner belongings, things guests didn't need. Later that evening, when the owner checked in by message to ask if everything was okay, I mentioned the locked door. The reply came back almost immediately. Just storage, nothing you'll need. That was all. No follow-up, no explanation. The conversation moved on to trash pickup and checkout time. We accepted it without discussion. Over the next day, the cabin settled into a rhythm. We cooked meals, took short walks, sat outside in the evenings until the light faded. Everything felt calm, predictable, and contained, except for the hallway. It wasn't threatening, it just felt quieter. Conversations dropped off as we passed through it. Footsteps sounded softer there. The overhead light never seemed quite as bright, even though the bulb was the same as the others. By the end of the second day, I noticed something else. Nothing ever stayed near that door. Shoes lined up neatly on the opposite wall. Bags leaned against the bedroom doors instead. Even a chair that had been in the hallway when we arrived had slowly been moved away. inch by inch, until the space in front of the locked door was completely clear. No one suggested doing it, it just happened. At night, the hallway stayed darker than the rest of the cabin. Not because the light was off, because the light didn't seem to reach all the way down. I stood there once, looking at the door, listening. There was no sound coming from behind it, no movement, no vibration, no indication that anything was wrong. Still, I didn't touch the handle. Not because I was scared, because it didn't feel like something I was supposed to do. On the third morning, I moved a chair. It wasn't a decision I thought through. I had finished breakfast and was clearing the table when I realized there was nowhere obvious to put it. The hallway was closest, so I slid the chair out and placed it against the wall, a short distance from the locked door. It didn't touch the door. It didn't block it. It just sat there. No one commented on it. The rest of the day passed without incident. We left the cabin, came back in the afternoon, cooked dinner, and settled into the living area. The chair stayed where I had put it. That night was quiet. No sounds from outside, no creaks from the hallway, no shift in the air that suggested anything had changed. In the morning, the chair was gone. Not missing, not turned over, not pushed aside. It was back under the table, aligned neatly with the others, as if it had never been moved at all. I stood there for a moment, trying to remember if I had put it back myself. I hadn't. I was sure of that. I checked the floor for marks, scratches, anything that would explain how it had been moved. There was nothing. I didn't mention it to anyone. Later that day, I noticed something else. The outlet near the locked door was warm, not hot, just warm enough to feel different from the rest of the wall. I brushed my fingers along the paint, then checked another outlet down the hallway. Cold. That night, the air near the door felt heavier. Not a draft, not movement, just a steady difference, contained in that one section of the hallway. No sound came from behind the door, no vibration, no light, no indication of activity. Still, no one stood there anymore. When we passed through the hallway, we did it quickly, without stopping, without leaning against the walls. The space in front of the door remained clear, as if the cabin itself preferred it that way. By the end of the fourth day, we had all adjusted. Not consciously, not by agreement. We simply stopped testing the space. Whatever the room was being used for, it wasn't for us. And the cabin seemed to make that clear without ever needing to say it. We left the cabin on the fifth morning. No one suggested staying longer. No one said they felt unsafe. The plan ended exactly the way it was supposed to. Packing was quiet and efficient. Bags were zipped. Dishes were washed and dried. The living area was returned to the same neutral order it had been in when we arrived. The hallway stayed clear. No chairs, no shoes, no bags resting against the wall. The space in front of the locked door remained empty, undisturbed, like it had been waiting for us to finish. Before leaving, I stood at the end of the hallway and looked at the door one last time. It hadn't changed. The lock was still clean, the handle still untouched. There were no marks on the floor, no signs that anyone had entered or exited while we were there. It didn't feel like a room we had avoided. It felt like a room we had respected. We locked the cabin, returned the key, and drove away without incident. The road out felt familiar, almost comforting, like the world resuming its normal shape. It wasn't until later that day that I realized what unsettled me most. At no point did we decide not to open the door. There was no discussion, no warning, no reason we could point to. We simply followed a rule that had never been explained. The room wasn't hidden. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't forbidden. It just wasn't meant for us. And the cabin had made that clear from the moment we arrived. Some spaces don't react when you cross their boundaries. They simply wait for you to understand where you don't belong. We booked the cabin for 7 nights. That was intentional. Long stays smooth things out. You stop treating the place like a rental and start treating it like a temporary routine. That was what we wanted. Something quiet, predictable, forgettable. The listing described the cabin as self-maintained. No staff on site, no daily check-ins. just a simple structure in the woods that handled itself. When we arrived, nothing felt wrong. The cabin was clean, not freshly cleaned, just settled, like it had already decided how things should look and stayed that way. We unpacked, claimed rooms, and moved through the space naturally. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, living area facing the trees. Everything was where it was supposed to be. That night, the porch light turned on at exactly 6:42 p.m. None of us were near the switch. At first, it felt convenient. The sun dipped quickly behind the trees, and the light came on right as the cabin started to disappear into shadow. "Timer," someone said. That explanation held. The heater kicked on later that evening, not because it was cold, because it was the same time every night after that. The temperature inside the cabin didn't fluctuate. It settled into a range and stayed there. The next morning, the heater shut off at 7:15 a.m. No one touched it. By the 3rd day, we noticed the pattern. Lights, heat, even the way the cabin felt underfoot. Everything followed the same schedule, regardless of what we did. We tested it casually. One night we stayed out late. When we returned, the porch light was already on. The cabin was warm. The living area lights were off, exactly as they were every other night. Another morning, we slept in. When we woke up, the heater had already shut off. The air felt neutral, unchanged by our presence. It didn't feel automated, it felt expected. There was one area that stood out. The small table near the front window was always clear by evening, not because we kept it that way. If we left something there during the day, it would still be there when we returned. But by night, the surface was always empty. We never saw it happen. By the 4th day, we realized something else. We were starting to plan around the cabin instead of the other way around. We came back earlier, ate dinner at the same time each night, turned in when the light outside clicked on, even though no one said we had to. It wasn't fear, it was alignment. The cabin didn't react when we followed its rhythm. It simply continued. By the 5th day, the rhythm had stopped feeling noticeable. That was the part that bothered me later. We didn't talk about the timing anymore. The lights coming on, the heater adjusting, the way the cabin shifted through the day without us touching anything. It all blended into the background, like weather you no longer check because you already know how it will behave. We tried briefly to push against it. One afternoon we moved the small table away from the window and into the corner of the living area. It wasn't deliberate rebellion. We just needed the space. The window light made it hard to read, and the corner felt more practical. That evening, we came back later than usual. The porch light was on. Inside, the cabin was warm. The living area lights were off, the same as every night before. The table was back by the window, not shoved, not crooked, centered, clear. I stood there long enough for someone else to notice. "Did you move that back?" they asked. I shook my head. No one suggested another explanation. The moment passed without discussion, and we went on with our evening. That was when I realized the cabin wasn't correcting us immediately. It waited. The changes always happened when no one was present, overnight, or during the hours when we were gone. There was never a moment of transition, no sound, no indication that anything had moved at all. Things were simply right again. Over the next 2 days we noticed more of it. Shoes that drifted toward the entryway during the day ended up aligned neatly by morning. A chair pulled closer to the hallway returned to its earlier position. Even small items, like a book left on the arm of the couch, seemed to migrate back to the places we had first used them. Not faster, not slower, on schedule. We stopped testing it, not because we were afraid of consequences, but because the cabin didn't react when we complied. It didn't reward us. It didn't acknowledge us at all. It just continued. By the 6th night, we were eating dinner at the same time we had on the first evening. Not intentionally, it just felt right. Conversations slowed as the light outside clicked on. We cleaned up, not because we were tired, but because the room felt finished with us. Later, lying in bed, I realized something unsettling. The cabin wasn't adjusting to our habits. We were adjusting to its memory. Whatever had been happening there before we arrived hadn't stopped. We had just stepped into the middle of it. We left on the 7th morning. Not early, not late. Exactly when we had planned when we first booked the cabin. At the time, it had felt like an arbitrary decision. A checkout day chosen for convenience. Now it felt deliberate. Packing was quiet, not tense, not rushed, just methodical. Each item returned to the place it had occupied during the week, as if we were undoing ourselves in reverse order. The table stayed by the window. The chairs remained where they had settled, shoes lined up near the door without anyone suggesting it. The cabin looked complete again, not staged, not prepared, but finished. Before leaving, I walked through the rooms one last time. Nothing resisted. The lights stayed off. The temperature remained neutral. No system adjusted to acknowledge that we were leaving. The cabin didn't seem to register the change at all. That was when I understood something we hadn't said out loud all week. We weren't leaving early. We were leaving on time. Outside, the air felt different, sharper, less controlled. The porch light was still off in the daylight, waiting for its moment. I caught myself checking the time out of habit. 6:42 p.m. The drive out felt shorter than the drive in. The trees thinned quickly, the road widened, and the cabin disappeared behind us without ceremony. No sound, no movement, no reaction. Later that afternoon, while stopping for gas, my phone buzzed with a notification from the rental service. Your stay has ended. Thank you for returning the space as scheduled. The timestamp matched our departure time exactly. That message unsettled me more than anything else. Not because it arrived, but because it felt redundant. The cabin didn't need confirmation. It had already continued. Whatever routine had been in place before we arrived resumed without pause. Lights turning on, heat adjusting, surfaces clearing themselves by nightfall. We hadn't disrupted anything. We had simply occupied time that was already reserved. And when our part was over, the schedule moved on without us. We booked the cabin for 4 nights, not because we needed that long, but because it felt like the shortest stay that wouldn't rush the place. We wanted time for the cabin to register us, time for it to feel occupied, even briefly. The listing emphasized quiet, no neighbors, no nearby trails, no features worth mentioning. It wasn't framed as a retreat or a getaway, just a small cabin in the woods that stayed empty most of the year. When we arrived, nothing changed. The door opened without resistance. The air inside felt neutral, not cool, not warm, just still. The lights stayed off. The cabin didn't shift the way most places do when people step inside. Usually, you feel it. Floors respond, air moves. The faint sense that a space has noticed weight again. This one didn't. We set our bags down and moved through the rooms slowly. Shoes by the door, a jacket over the back of a chair, groceries on the counter. Each item landed, stayed, and made no difference at all. The cabin didn't feel unwelcoming. It felt indifferent. That first evening, we cooked dinner and ate quietly. When we finished, the kitchen looked exactly the same as it had before we arrived. Not reset, not tidied, just unchanged, as if we had never used it. I turned off the lights before bed, out of habit more than necessity. In the morning, they were still off. The temperature hadn't shifted overnight. The air felt identical to the night before. There was no sense of systems adjusting themselves around us. No subtle signs of maintenance or care. That would have been reassuring if it hadn't stayed that way. On the second day, we left early. We spent the entire day away, hiking and driving until well after dark. When we came back, the cabin looked exactly as we had left it. No porch light, no warmth waiting inside, no hint that the space had prepared for our return. The jacket was still on the chair, the shoes were still by the door. Even the grocery bags on the counter were untouched, sitting where we had dropped them the night before. Nothing had been corrected, nothing had been adjusted. Standing there, I realized something subtle. The cabin hadn't been holding space for us. It hadn't been waiting. That night, I woke briefly and listened. No sounds from the walls, no settling in the floor, no background hum. The cabin didn't feel asleep. It felt absent. By the third morning, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Whether we were there or not didn't change the cabin's state. It didn't adjust when we arrived. It didn't reset when we left. It didn't respond at all. We weren't disturbing anything. We were occupying rooms that didn't seem to register us. And the longer we stayed, the clearer it became. This wasn't a place that noticed people coming and going. It was a place that didn't need to. On the third morning, we left the cabin before sunrise. There was nothing special planned. We just wanted to spend the day away, to see the nearby town, and drive the longer road that looped through the forest. We locked the door, checked the windows, and left the cabin exactly as it was. Lights off, thermostat untouched, our things scattered where we had used them the night before. A mug sat on the counter with a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. A book lay open on the couch, pages bent slightly where I had fallen asleep reading. The jacket was still on the chair. We didn't expect the cabin to do anything while we were gone. That was the point. We stayed away the entire day. Lunch in town, a long drive that turned into evening before we noticed the time. By the time we came back, the sky was already dark. The cabin looked the same from the outside. No porch light, no glow from the windows. No sign that the space inside had shifted states in our absence. When we unlocked the door and stepped in, nothing greeted us. The air felt identical to the morning, still, neutral. The lights remained off until I turned them on myself. The temperature hadn't adjusted for night. Inside, everything was exactly where we had left it. The mug hadn't been moved. The book was still open. The jacket still hung from the chair at the same angle. It felt less like returning to a place we were staying, and more like stepping back into a paused frame. That night, we left again. Not for long, just long enough to walk the road and stand outside in the dark. When we came back, nothing had changed. The cabin didn't acknowledge the interruption. On the fourth day, we pushed it further. We left before noon and didn't return until well after midnight. The result was the same. No lights on. No warmth waiting. No sense that the space had noticed the gap. One detail stood out. A small lamp on the side table had been left on by accident the night before. When we returned the next day, it was still on. The bulb warm to the touch. The light unchanged. The cabin hadn't corrected it. That was when it became clear. The cabin didn't reset when we were gone. It didn't prepare for our return. It didn't conserve itself. It simply remained. Our absence didn't register as an event. Later that night, I tried to imagine the cabin without us entirely. Days passing, nights coming and going, the same lamp left on, the same mug drying on the counter. The idea wasn't unsettling because something might happen. It was unsettling because nothing would. By the end of the fourth day, we stopped talking about when we would be back. We stopped checking the cabin before leaving. Whether we were inside or miles away didn't seem to matter. The cabin wasn't holding our place. It wasn't aware that we were gone at all. On the fourth day, we stayed inside. Not because of the weather, not because we were tired. We just wanted to see what would happen if we didn't leave at all, if presence made any difference. Morning passed quietly. We made coffee, sat at the table, read, moved from room to room without purpose. The cabin didn't respond to the activity. No change in temperature, no shift in light, no sense of adjustment as the hours moved forward. Most places react when you occupy them for too long. Heat builds, air thickens, floors creak differently once they've carried weight all day. This cabin didn't. By noon, the rooms felt exactly as they had at sunrise. Still, neutral, balanced. Our movement through the space left no impression behind. We tried filling the space. Music played softly from a phone on the counter. We opened and closed cabinets, left drawers out longer than necessary. At one point, we turned on every light in the cabin and left them on while we sat in silence. Nothing changed. The lights didn't warm the room. The air didn't shift. The cabin didn't feel occupied. In the afternoon, we rearranged things. Chairs were moved closer together. The table was pulled away from the wall. A blanket was draped over the couch instead of folded at the end. We left everything that way and waited. Hours passed. When evening came, the cabin looked exactly the same. No correction, no reset, no response. It wasn't resisting us. It simply wasn't acknowledging us. That realization settled slowly. We weren't staying in a place that adapted to people. We were passing through a space that didn't include people in its process at all. At one point, I stood in the hallway and listened. Not for sounds, for a reaction. Anything that suggested the cabin was aware of sustained presence. There was nothing. The silence wasn't tense. It wasn't watchful. It was complete. Later, as night came on, we turned the lights off one by one and sat in the dark. The cabin didn't seem to change state. It didn't become quieter or louder. It didn't feel like it was settling for the night. It felt the same as it had all day. That was when I understood why leaving hadn't mattered. Staying didn't either. We weren't being ignored. We were irrelevant. The cabin wasn't indifferent out of neglect. It was indifferent by design. Whatever cycle governed the space didn't include us as a variable. We could arrive, we could stay, we could leave. None of it registered as a meaningful change. By the time we went to bed that night, the decision to leave the next day felt obvious. Not urgent, not emotional, just accurate. Because occupying the cabin longer wouldn't create a connection. And leaving wouldn't end anything that had never begun. We decided to leave a day early. There was no discussion about fear or discomfort, no moment where one of us said something was wrong. The decision came quietly, the way obvious things do when you finally stop arguing with them. We packed without urgency. Clothes folded, bags zipped, the table cleared. Everything returned to the places where it had spent the last few days, not because the cabin demanded it, but because disorder felt pointless. Nothing in the cabin responded to our preparation. The lights stayed off until we turned them on. The temperature didn't shift as doors opened and closed. The air felt the same whether we were moving or standing still. At one point, I paused in the living area and looked around, expecting some sign that the space recognized what was happening. There was none. The cabin didn't feel like it was being left behind. It felt like it was being left exactly as it was. Before locking the door, we walked through each room one last time, not to check for belongings, but out of habit. The jacket still hung on the chair. The mug was still on the counter. The lamp we had left on the night before continued to glow, unchanged. It struck me then that leaving early didn't interrupt anything. We weren't ending a stay. We were removing ourselves from something that hadn't included us to begin with. Outside, the forest looked the same as it had all week. No shift in sound, no sudden stillness. The cabin behind us made no noise when the door closed. When I turned the key, there was no sense of closure. Some places feel different when you leave them. Lighter, quieter, as if the space exhales once you're gone. This one didn't. We stood on the porch for a moment, neither of us in a hurry to walk away. Not because we were reluctant, but because there was nothing to resolve. Leaving didn't feel final. It felt incidental. As we drove away, I checked the mirror, half expecting to see the cabin recede into the trees, becoming smaller, less present. It didn't. The road curved, the trees closed in, and the cabin disappeared from view without ceremony. Later, I realized why that moment had unsettled me. We hadn't chosen to leave because something was wrong. We had chosen to leave because staying didn't matter, and walking away didn't change the state of the place at all. We didn't check out in the usual way. There was no message sent, no final walkthrough requested, no sense that our departure needed to be acknowledged. We left the key in the lockbox, closed the door, and drove away exactly the way we had arrived. The cabin didn't respond. Hours later, the day continued without interruption. Traffic, gas stations, normal conversations. Nothing followed us, nothing lingered. That should have been reassuring. Instead, what stayed with me was the absence of aftermath. Most places leave something behind when you go. A smell on your clothes, a feeling of relief, even irritation. Some sign that time was shared and then separated again. This one didn't. The cabin didn't feel unfinished. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with us being there. Later that evening, I realized something unsettling. At no point during our stay had the cabin reacted to our presence. Not when we arrived, not when we stayed, not when we left early. It hadn't ignored us. Ignoring requires attention first. We had simply never been counted. I imagined the cabin after we were gone. The same light remaining off, the same air holding steady, the same objects resting where we left them, not waiting to be corrected. Days could pass without change. Nights could come and go without acknowledgement. The space wouldn't decay. It wouldn't reset. It wouldn't prepare. It would just remain. That was the part that made it difficult to explain to anyone else. There was no story of danger, no moment of threat, nothing I could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. Nothing had gone wrong at all. We had entered a place that didn't require people to function, a place that wasn't empty, but complete on its own terms. Leaving didn't close a chapter, because nothing had opened when we arrived. The cabin didn't notice us leaving. It never needed to. We booked the cabin in late October, after the season had already ended. The listing mentioned that it had been quiet for weeks. No recent guests, no overlapping bookings. That was part of the appeal. We wanted a place that had been left alone long enough to feel empty again. At first glance, it looked that way. The cabin was clean, but not in the careful, staged way rentals usually are. The air smelled neutral, not fresh, not stale, just settled, like a place that had been closed but not forgotten. We dropped our bags by the door and started unpacking. That was when I noticed the mug. It sat on the counter, pushed slightly back toward the wall, as if someone had finished using it and meant to come back later. There was a faint ring at the bottom, already dry, not fresh coffee, not old enough to feel abandoned either. I picked it up, turned it over, and checked the sink. No other dishes. Probably from before, my friend said. They must have missed it. That explanation worked well enough. In the bedroom, the blanket on one of the beds was folded differently from the others. Not sloppy, just unfamiliar. The edge was tucked in a way I didn't recognize. Tighter on one side, loose on the other. Like someone had made it without caring how it looked to the next person. We didn't say anything about that either. Small things get overlooked in rentals all the time. As we moved through the cabin, we noticed more details like that. A chair at the table was pulled out slightly farther than the rest. One window latch was already half open. In the bathroom, a hand towel hung lower than the others, damp enough that it hadn't fully dried yet. Each thing on its own meant nothing. Together, they felt recent. We checked the booking details again that night. No overlapping dates, no previous guests listed in the days before us. The calendar was blank. Later, while making dinner, I moved the mug to the sink and rinsed it out. I folded the blanket properly, pulled the chair back in, closed the latch and rehung the towel. The cabin looked more like a rental after that. Neutral, balanced, ready. Even the surfaces felt different once we were done. Clear, orderly, as if we had corrected small mistakes rather than arrived at the start of something new. That should have been the end of it. But even then, the space didn't feel reclaimed. It felt adjusted, as if we had corrected the surface without understanding how the place was actually being used. That night, as we turned the lights off and settled in, I had the odd sense that we hadn't arrived at an empty cabin. We had arrived between uses, and whatever had been there before us hadn't finished yet. The next morning, we moved everything that didn't feel like ours into one place. It wasn't an argument or a decision we discussed. We just started doing it. The mug went into the sink. The oddly folded blanket was smoothed and tucked in properly. The chair was pushed in. The window latch was closed. The damp towel was replaced with a dry one from the closet. By mid-morning, the cabin looked the way it was supposed to. Clean, neutral, empty. That should have settled the feeling. Instead, it made it easier to notice when things shifted back. We left the cabin for a few hours that afternoon. Nothing special. A drive. Lunch in town. When we returned, the light was already starting to fade. The first thing I saw was the chair. It was pulled out again. Not far, just enough to notice. I stopped in the doorway and stared at it longer than I meant to. The rest of the room looked fine, balanced, orderly. But the chair sat exactly where it had been the day before. "Did you move that?" I asked. My friend shook their head. We checked the rest of the cabin slowly. The window latch was half open again. The blanket on the bed had been folded back into that unfamiliar shape, tighter on one side than the other. In the bathroom, the hand towel hung low, still slightly damp. The mug was back on the counter, not in the sink, not drying, pushed slightly toward the wall, with a faint ring beginning to form at the bottom again. No doors were unlocked, no windows were open. Nothing suggested someone had been inside. We stood there without speaking, not frightened, just uncertain about how to respond. That night, we didn't touch anything. The next morning, the cabin looked exactly the same. Nothing had escalated, nothing had multiplied. The same few details sat slightly out of place, as if someone had paused in the middle of using them and never returned. We tried again. That afternoon, we gathered the items and put them somewhere different. The mug went into a cupboard. The towel was folded and placed on a shelf. The blanket was rolled instead of folded. We left for the evening. When we came back, the cupboard door was open. The mug was back on the counter. The towel hung from the rack. The blanket was folded the way it had been before. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sound, no trace of movement, no sense of intrusion, just correction. That was when it became clear that we weren't discovering forgotten items. We were interrupting something that hadn't finished yet. The cabin wasn't messy. It was mid-routine. By the third day, we stopped trying to fix anything. Not because we were afraid to touch the objects, but because it was becoming clear that our version of order wasn't the one the cabin recognized. Every attempt to clean, rearrange, or store things away felt temporary, like correcting a surface that always returned to its previous shape. The signs weren't random. The chair was always pulled out to the same distance. The mug was always placed in the same spot, angled slightly toward the wall. The towel always hung lower than the others, damp just enough to suggest recent use. Nothing drifted or degraded over time. It reset with precision. That was when we realized these weren't leftover items. They were markers. Something in the cabin wasn't finished with them yet. We tested that idea carefully. Instead of removing the objects, we tried to interrupt the sequence. We left the chair pulled out farther than usual. We filled the mug with water and left it on the counter. We folded the towel and placed it directly on the bathroom sink. We stayed inside that afternoon, listening. Nothing happened. No sounds from the walls, no movement from the floor. No indication that anything had changed while we were watching. The cabin remained perfectly still, as if it had no need to react while we were present. That evening, we went out for dinner. When we returned, the pattern had resumed. The chair was back at its familiar angle. The mug was empty again, resting in its usual place. The towel hung low on the rack, slightly damp, exactly as it had been before. The sequence hadn't been broken. It had waited. That was the detail we couldn't ignore. Whatever was using the cabin didn't adapt to resistance. It didn't escalate or respond emotionally. It simply continued its routine whenever the space was available. We began to notice how consistent the timing was. The changes never happened while we were inside. They occurred during gaps, short absences, moments when the cabin was empty enough to resume its process. We weren't sharing the space, we were blocking it. That realization changed how we moved through the cabin. We avoided the chair. We stopped using the counter space near the mug. We chose towels from the closet instead of the rack, not out of fear, out of courtesy. It felt less like coexisting with something unseen and more like standing in the middle of a workflow we didn't understand. Every object seemed to have a role, and none of those roles included us. By the end of the day, the cabin felt occupied in a way that had nothing to do with people. The space wasn't empty, it was mid-use, and the longer we stayed, the more obvious it became that we weren't part of that use at all. By the fourth day, we stopped pretending we were the ones using the cabin. Nothing had escalated. There were no new objects, no louder signs, no sense of pressure. The same details returned, quietly and consistently, whenever the space was left alone. The routine didn't grow more aggressive. It didn't adapt to us. It simply continued without us. That was when we changed our behavior. We stopped moving the chair altogether. We avoided the counter space near the mug. We took towels directly from the closet and left the rack untouched. Not because we were afraid of disturbing something, but because it felt wrong to interfere with a process we didn't understand. The cabin felt different once we did that. Not safer, not calmer, more complete. The objects no longer felt out of place. They felt assigned, as if they belonged to a version of the cabin that existed alongside us, running on its own quiet schedule. That illusion broke in the afternoon. I noticed my jacket folded on the arm of the couch, instead of hanging by the door where I had left it. The fold was careful, intentional, not neat but precise, like someone had moved it out of the way rather than put it away. I asked if anyone had touched it. No one had. We checked the rest of our things. My bag had been shifted a few inches closer to the wall. A notebook sat on the table, closed, its corner aligned with the edge, as if someone had squared it deliberately. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. Our things hadn't been disturbed. They had been relocated. That was the moment it became impossible to deny. We weren't sharing the cabin. We were intruding on it. The space wasn't correcting our messes. It was reorganizing around us, gently but decisively, the way you move an obstacle without acknowledging it. Once that thought settled, everything else made sense. The cabin didn't react when we arrived because arrival wasn't relevant. It didn't react when we stayed because presence didn't matter. And it wouldn't react when we left because departure wasn't part of its cycle either. We weren't guests. We were variables that kept getting pushed aside. That evening, we sat at the table and didn't touch anything. We didn't cook. We didn't rearrange. We didn't even speak much. It felt like waiting in a room that wasn't meant to pause for you. For the first time since we arrived, the cabin felt actively occupied. Not by a presence we could name, but by a purpose that didn't include us at all. We left the next morning without cleaning. Not out of defiance, not out of fear. It simply felt inappropriate to rearrange a space that had already made it clear how little our intentions mattered. We packed quietly, keeping our movements small, careful not to disturb anything that didn't belong to us. Our things went into the car first. Nothing else was touched. The chair stayed pulled out. The mug stayed on the counter. The towel remained on the rack, still faintly damp. For the first time, the cabin looked right. That realization sat with me as we walked through each room one last time. Not checking for items, not saying goodbye, just observing. The space felt settled in a way it hadn't before, as if our decision to leave without correcting anything finally aligned with whatever process had been running there all along. When we locked the door, there was no sense of finality, no closure, no relief, no feeling of having escaped something. The cabin didn't resist our departure. It didn't seem to register it at all. Later that day, while driving home, I tried to explain the experience to someone over the phone. The words came out flat, uneventful. There was nothing dramatic to point to, no moment where things clearly went wrong. That was the problem. Nothing had gone wrong. We hadn't interrupted a threat. We hadn't avoided danger. We had simply stepped out of the way. The thought that stayed with me was this: if we hadn't arrived at all, the cabin would have continued exactly as it was. If we had stayed longer, it would have continued the same way. And now that we were gone, nothing needed to change. The objects would remain where they were until whatever routine required them was finished. The chair would be pulled out again. The towel would dry and then be damp once more. The mug would be used, emptied, and set back in place. Not by us. Driving away, I realized why the cabin felt so difficult to remember clearly. It hadn't given us anything to carry with us. No fear, no aftermath, no story shaped around people. Just the quiet certainty that we had spent time inside a place that didn't recognize us as participants at all. We weren't guests, we were incidental. And the cabin, complete on its own terms, still had its things. We didn't find the cabin through any of the usual listings. There was no featured photo, no bold headline promising peace or escape. The page looked unfinished, almost forgotten, with a few dim images and a short description that focused only on availability. No mention of views, no reassurance about comfort, just dates and a price. It didn't feel like an invitation, it felt like access. The owner's messages were brief, polite, but impersonal. When we asked questions, the answers came back factual and narrow, as if anything beyond logistics wasn't relevant. Check-in time, lockbox code, directions that avoided landmarks. Nothing about enjoying the stay. That should have stood out more than it did. When we arrived, the cabin didn't announce itself. There was no porch light, no sign, no sense of arrival beyond the road ending abruptly at a clearing. The building sat low among the trees, its shape practical rather than welcoming, like something placed where it was needed rather than where someone wanted to live. Inside, everything worked. The door closed smoothly, the lights turned on without flicker. The heat responded immediately, but the space offered no cues about how to settle in. Furniture was arranged efficiently, not comfortably. The couch faced nothing in particular. The table was centered with no thought to conversation. The bed sat against the wall, with just enough clearance to walk around it. It was functional, not hostile, but it wasn't generous. There were no personal touches, no books, no art. No signs that anyone had ever tried to soften the place. Even the windows felt secondary, narrow, and placed higher than expected, letting in light without encouraging anyone to look out. We unpacked quietly, without comment. The longer we stayed still, the clearer it became that the cabin wasn't waiting for us. The silence wasn't expectant. It wasn't the calm of a place anticipating use. It was the silence of something already running. That night, as we sat at the table with the lights on, I realized I couldn't imagine anyone designing the space for rest. It felt designed to remain occupied, without being inhabited, as if the cabin wasn't meant to host people, just to exist while they passed through. By the second day, it was clear that nothing in the cabin was malfunctioning. The heater worked exactly when it was turned on. The lights responded instantly. Water pressure stayed consistent, no matter the time of day. Every system behaved the way it was supposed to. If anything, the place ran more smoothly than most cabins we had stayed in before. That was the problem. Comfort usually comes from small inefficiencies, from adjustments people make over time. A chair angled toward a window, a couch positioned for conversation, a lamp placed where someone once needed light and never moved it again. None of that existed here. Every object sat where it was most efficient, not where it was most pleasant. The chairs faced the table, not each other. The couch aligned with the wall instead of the view. Even the bed felt positioned for access rather than rest, leaving clear paths on either side, as if movement mattered more than sleep. We tried to live in the space anyway. Breakfast felt awkward. There was nowhere natural to sit with a cup of coffee. Standing at the counter felt more appropriate than sitting down. The table encouraged separation instead of gathering. Each of us ended up eating alone, not by choice, but because the layout quietly suggested it. Throughout the day, we noticed how often we adjusted ourselves instead of the space. We moved our bodies to fit the room instead of moving the room to fit us. We avoided certain corners because they felt unfinished. We stopped opening the curtains because the windows weren't placed for looking out. Light entered the cabin without offering a view, as if observation was unnecessary. By afternoon, the fatigue wasn't physical, it was cognitive. Living there required constant micro-decisions. Where to stand, where to place things temporarily, how to move without interrupting whatever logic governed the layout. The cabin demanded efficiency from us, even though we had come there to slow down. Nothing resisted us. Nothing welcomed us either. That evening, I realized the space didn't fail at being comfortable. Comfort had never been the goal. The cabin functioned perfectly, just not for people who wanted to linger. It felt designed to remain operational, not inhabited, as if human presence was expected to be brief, and any attempt to settle in was simply tolerated until it ended. Cabin wasn't optimized for people, came from the way it guided movement. Not blocked, not restricted, directed. Paths through the room felt intentional, as if the space expected something to pass through regularly. The floor was worn in narrow lines that didn't match how we walked. Corners were rounded where no one ever stood. Clearances existed where furniture usually wouldn't allow them. It wasn't random design, it was use pattern. The chair by the table was rotated slightly off axis, not facing the table or the wall, but angled toward the center of the room. Sitting in it felt wrong, like occupying a lane meant to stay open. We kept pushing it back, and it kept returning to that same orientation. The couch was worse. It faced nothing, not the window, not the fireplace. Sitting there didn't invite rest, it invited waiting. We found ourselves sitting upright without realizing it, as if lying down would interrupt something unseen. Even the kitchen felt misaligned. Counters were placed a little too high, shelves a little too low, not enough to be uncomfortable, but enough to feel inefficient. Every task took slightly more effort than expected. That was when it clicked. The space wasn't badly designed. It was designed for a different body. Not smaller, not larger, just different. Movement through the cabin favored speed over comfort. Turns were gentle and wide. There were no dead ends. Nothing encouraged stopping for long. Everything seemed arranged to keep whatever used the space in motion. We looked for signs of another occupant. There were none. No footprints, no hair, no marks on the floor that suggested weight. The cabin was immaculate in the way a workspace is immaculate, not the way a home is kept. That distinction mattered. Homes accumulate adjustments. Workspaces enforce consistency. By the third afternoon, we noticed how little the cabin changed regardless of what we did. Chairs returned to their angles. Doors never stayed fully open. Objects settled back into positions that made sense only in relation to the structure itself. It wasn't correcting us. It was maintaining itself. We tried to sit still and let the space settle around us. It didn't. The cabin didn't slow down when we stopped moving. It didn't grow quieter or more aware. The hum beneath the silence remained constant, like a system that never powered down. That was the moment the discomfort shifted. Not into fear, into displacement. We weren't trespassing in the usual sense. We weren't somewhere forbidden. We were simply present in a place that didn't register presence the way human spaces do. We had assumed the cabin was neutral. It wasn't. It was specific. And whatever it was specific for, it wasn't us. The longer we stayed, the clearer that became. We weren't visitors. We were noise in a system that preferred continuity over comfort and efficiency over rest. By the fourth day, we stopped trying to adapt the cabin to us. Instead, we adapted ourselves to it. Meals became shorter. We stood more than we sat. We slept in narrower positions, instinctively avoiding the edges of the bed where the space felt unused. We moved along the paths the room seemed to prefer, not because we were told to, but because anything else felt inefficient, like swimming against a current you can't see. The cabin didn't resist these changes. It accommodated them. That was the unsettling part. The moment we stopped treating the place like a home and started treating it like a system, everything ran smoother. Movement felt easier. The awkwardness receded. The cognitive effort we'd been spending just to exist there dropped noticeably. The space worked better once we stopped asking it to care about us. That realization landed slowly. The cabin wasn't hostile. It wasn't broken. It simply had no concept of comfort as a priority. Comfort required feedback, adjustment, memory. This place operated on repeatable conditions, not lived experience. At night, the pattern became clearer. Lights didn't invite rest, they enforced visibility. Darkness didn't signal sleep, it marked an inactive state. The hum beneath the silence never changed pitch or rhythm, as if the cabin didn't distinguish between night and day at all. We tried to test that. One evening, we stayed awake far later than usual, sitting still in the dark, waiting for the space to respond. It didn't. The cabin didn't slow, it didn't settle, it didn't acknowledge the disruption, it continued. By morning, we were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Our bodies had rested, but our sense of orientation hadn't. Time inside the cabin felt flat, like a process measured in cycles rather than hours. That was when it became obvious that we weren't failing to live there. Living there was never the goal. The cabin wasn't designed to support routines that accumulate meaning. It supported sequences that reset cleanly. Tasks began and ended without residue. Presence left no imprint. We noticed it in the smallest ways. Our voices felt out of place once conversations ended. Our belongings looked temporary no matter how long they stayed put. Even our shadows felt secondary, cast onto surfaces that didn't register them. At some point that afternoon, we stopped talking about when we would leave. Not because we were afraid to, because the idea of staying longer stopped making sense. We weren't being pushed out, we were being rendered unnecessary. The cabin didn't need us to function. It didn't require witnesses, caretakers, or occupants. Whatever process governed the space would continue with or without human involvement. By the end of the day, that understanding had settled fully. We weren't guests waiting for acceptance. We were interruptions that the system had learned to route around. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, the way understanding does when it isn't meant to be dramatic. A detail here, a connection there. Small observations that aligned too cleanly to ignore. Late that afternoon, while moving a chair back into its familiar position, I noticed something etched faintly into the wood near the floor. Not a message, not a symbol, just a shallow line, worn smooth by repetition, running parallel to the wall. It wasn't damage, it was guidance. Once I saw it, I started seeing similar marks elsewhere. Along the base of the counter, near the doorway, at the edge of the hallway where the floor curved slightly inward. Subtle paths, reinforced over time, as if the cabin had been built to accommodate a sequence of movements that repeated again and again. Not footsteps, flow. We searched for blueprints out of curiosity, not fear. Old documents in a drawer, a folded sheet behind the breaker panel. What we found wasn't a floor plan meant for living. It was closer to a schematic, measurements without labels, distances between points, clearances marked with numbers but no explanations. There were no notes about comfort, no references to people. Whatever the cabin was designed for, it wasn't shelter in the human sense. It was infrastructure, a space built to support a process, not an experience. That was the moment the last assumption fell away. We hadn't been intruding. We hadn't been ignored. We simply weren't relevant to the design intent. The cabin didn't malfunction when we stayed too long. It didn't resist us when we moved things. It tolerated our presence the way a system tolerates noise until it passes. That understanding reframed everything. The awkward furniture, the sleepless nights, the sense of displacement. None of it was accidental. The cabin wasn't failing at being a home. It had never attempted to be one. By evening, the decision to leave felt less like escape and more like correction. Not because we were afraid of what might happen if we stayed, but because staying longer served no purpose. The space didn't require adaptation. It required clearance. As we packed, we moved quickly and efficiently, following the same paths the cabin seemed to prefer. Nothing snagged. Nothing felt out of place. For the first time, our movements matched the room. And once they did, it became obvious why we were meant to pass through, not remain. We left without closing anything that didn't need to be closed. The door latched the way it always had. The lights went out when we flipped the switch. The cabin accepted the change without pause, without reaction, as if departure was just another state it already knew how to handle. Driving away felt strangely uneventful. No weight lifted, no sense of relief. The road simply continued, and the cabin slipped out of view like a background process losing priority. Days passed. Nothing followed us. That should have been the end of the story. It would have been easier if there had been something to point to afterward. A dream, a sound, a feeling that lingered. But the absence of consequence was the consequence. Weeks later, I tried to remember specific moments from inside the cabin and found that most of them refused to stay distinct. Meals blurred together, conversations dissolved. Even the layout faded, leaving behind only an impression of movement without rest. What remained wasn't fear, it was clarity. The cabin hadn't rejected us. It hadn't tolerated us. It had simply continued its function, indifferent to whether we were present to observe it or not. That was the part that stayed with me. We're used to places responding to us. Homes remember, hotels adapt. Even empty buildings feel altered once you've occupied them. They change temperature, they settle, they wait. That cabin did none of that. It didn't hold space for memory. It didn't mark time by use. It didn't require acknowledgement to proceed. It existed the way infrastructure exists, necessary, specific, unconcerned with who passes through as long as the process continues. I realized then that our discomfort hadn't come from being watched or threatened. It came from being unnecessary, from standing inside something that didn't recognize presence as meaningful input. If we had never arrived, the cabin would have continued. If we had stayed longer, it would have continued. And now that we were gone, nothing needed to reset or recover. The process didn't end. It didn't begin with us either. The cabin wasn't empty when we arrived. It wasn't occupied when we left. It simply continued. And somewhere, deep in the quiet of that understanding, was the most unsettling thought of all. Not everything is built to include us. Some things work better when we are not part of the equation. I came back to the area 3 months later for a completely unrelated reason. A delivery job, a different route. If I hadn't missed a turn and lost signal, I wouldn't have driven past the road at all. The trees had changed with the season, thicker now, heavier, the ground dark with moisture. The clearing appeared suddenly, familiar in a way that took a second to register. The cabin was still there, not abandoned, not reopened, just present. I pulled over without thinking about it. The place didn't look locked down or neglected. There were no boards on the windows, no signs warning people away. The structure looked exactly the way it had the day we left, as if time had passed everywhere else but here. I stepped out of the car and stood at the edge of the clearing. Nothing announced my return. No creak from the porch, no shift in light, no sense that the space recognized repetition. It didn't feel like coming back to somewhere I had stayed. It felt like passing through somewhere that had never noticed me in the first place. The door wasn't locked. That struck me as odd, but not alarming. Inside, the air was neutral, neither cold nor stale. The lights turned on instantly. The interior looked maintained, but not reset. Furniture sat in positions that made sense to the room, not to memory. I searched for something familiar, a scuff on the floor, a mark on the wall, any sign that time had layered instead of erased. There was nothing I could point to and say, I remember doing that here. The space didn't feel empty. It felt uninterrupted. Even the objects seemed indifferent to being recognized. The table, the chair, the counter, none of them triggered a sense of return. They were where they were supposed to be, but not where I remembered them. That difference mattered. I realized then that I wasn't revisiting a place from my past. I was entering a system that had continued operating without logging my presence as an event. Whatever had happened during our stay hadn't registered as a change. Standing there, I understood why the memory of the cabin had been so hard to hold on to. It wasn't resisting recall. It had never been archived. I left after only a few minutes, unsettled not by what I saw, but by how little the space acknowledged sequence. Arrival and return felt identical. As I drove away, the cabin slipped behind the trees without consequence. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had never needed to remember me at all. I walked through the cabin slowly, not because I expected something to change, but because I wanted to understand what hadn't. Most places keep evidence. Even when they're cleaned, they remember use in small ways. A corner worn down, a surface dulled by touch, objects settling into habits that reflect the people who passed through. This cabin didn't. I opened drawers and closed them again. Everything inside was arranged with a precision that felt current, not restored. Utensils aligned perfectly. Shelves balanced without empty gaps where something might have once been. It wasn't the absence of mess that felt wrong. It was the absence of correction. Nothing suggested that a previous state had been adjusted or overwritten. The cabin hadn't been reset after us. It had simply continued forward, unchanged by our presence. I checked the breaker panel out of habit. Dates were written neatly along the side in pencil, marking inspections and routine checks. There was no gap. No annotation that hinted at an interruption. The timeline flowed cleanly from one entry to the next. Our stay wasn't there. I stood in front of the panel longer than necessary, trying to reconcile memory with record. Weeks we had spent inside this place existed clearly in my mind, yet on the wall in front of me, time moved uninterrupted, indifferent to experience. I moved to the kitchen and studied the counter where the mug had always rested. The surface was unmarked. No faint ring, no discoloration. If a cup had ever been placed there, it hadn't mattered enough to register. That realization tightened something in my chest. I wasn't looking at a place that had erased us. Erasure implies effort. This space had never stored us in the first place. In the bathroom, towels were folded identically, edges squared, as if they belonged to a supply rather than a household. There was no sign that one had ever been used differently. No variation, no memory. The logic became impossible to ignore. The cabin didn't track events. It tracked conditions. Temperature, load, cycle. People weren't part of that system. We were transient variables that passed through without triggering a record. Like a fluctuation too small to be logged, too brief to alter the curve. I tried to imagine how many others had come through without being counted. How many arrivals and departures had blended into the same uninterrupted line of operation. Standing there, the most unsettling thought wasn't that the cabin had forgotten us. It was that nothing had been lost at all, because nothing about us had ever been considered necessary to keep. I left the cabin knowing I hadn't uncovered a mystery. I had confirmed a process. One that continued cleanly, precisely, and without any need to remember who had been there. I started paying attention to the rhythms instead of the rooms. Lights followed a schedule that didn't respond to presence. The heater cycled at fixed intervals, regardless of temperature changes caused by doors opening or closing. Even the water pressure pulsed in a predictable pattern, rising and falling as if tied to a loop rather than demand. It wasn't reactive. It was procedural. I stood by the window and watched the light shift across the floor. The shadow line moved at a steady pace, not adjusted by curtains or furniture placement. The cabin didn't try to optimize for visibility or comfort. It maintained alignment. I found a small maintenance sheet tucked behind a cabinet. Not a log of guests, a checklist. Boxes marked with dates. Systems verified. Power, airflow, drainage. Nothing about occupancy. Nothing about wear from use. People were never mentioned. The realization reframed everything I had felt during our stay. The awkward furniture, the sense of being out of sync, the fatigue that came from constant adjustment. None of it was accidental. The cabin was not indifferent to humans. It was indifferent to inputs it was never designed to measure. I tested that idea by doing something simple. I sat completely still in the center of the room and waited. Minutes passed. The systems continued. Air moved, heat cycled, light shifted. The cabin didn't slow down or speed up. It didn't register the pause as an anomaly. When I stood up, nothing compensated. No correction, no recalibration. The system remained stable. Later that evening, I tried the opposite. I moved deliberately and inefficiently, opening and closing doors, standing where no path existed, lingering in corners the space seemed to avoid. The cabin offered no feedback. It didn't resist or adapt. It simply continued its cycles, as if my actions were static noise. That was when it became clear that presence was not an event here. Movement didn't count. Stillness didn't count. Only conditions did. I tried to imagine the cabin without anyone entering it at all. Weeks passing, seasons changing, the same cycles repeating, uninterrupted, indifferent to whether anyone observed them. The thought wasn't frightening, it was clarifying. This wasn't a place that forgot people. It was a place that never logged them. Whatever process the cabin supported existed on a timeline that didn't intersect with human memory. Arrivals and departures were invisible because they were irrelevant. Standing there, I felt something shift, not panic, not dread, but displacement. A quiet understanding that some systems are built to function without narrative. They don't remember, they don't record stories, they just continue, as long as conditions allow. I left the cabin knowing that returning again wouldn't change anything. Not because I wouldn't be recognized, but because recognition was never part of the system in the first place. I didn't stay long the second time. There was nothing left to confirm, and nothing new to provoke. The cabin had already demonstrated what it needed to demonstrate by continuing exactly as it always had. Remaining longer would have been a gesture without an audience. I walked through each room once more, slowly, not searching for proof, but letting the absence of it settle. The system cycled. The light shifted. The hum beneath the silence stayed constant. The place felt neither finished nor unfinished. It felt ongoing. At the door, I hesitated, not out of fear, but because the moment felt indistinguishable from arrival. Leaving carried no punctuation, no closing note. It was simply another transition the cabin already knew how to absorb. Outside, the clearing looked unchanged. The trees held their distance. The road waited the same way it always had. I realized then that nothing about this place framed human presence as an event worth marking. I locked the door and immediately questioned why. The action didn't feel wrong, just unnecessary. Whatever operated inside the cabin didn't depend on access or exclusion. The lock was a courtesy for people, not a control for the space. Driving away, I tried to name what had unsettled me most. It wasn't that the cabin had erased us. It wasn't that it had ignored us. It was that our time there hadn't intersected with its purpose at all. We hadn't been witnesses to something hidden. We had been background noise to something ordinary. Weeks passed again. Nothing changed. I returned to the area once more, months later, not to visit the cabin, but because the road passed nearby. From a distance, through the trees, I could see the roofline in the same position, unchanged. There were no signs of neglect, no visible improvement either. The structure existed in a steady state, neither aging nor renewing itself in any noticeable way. That image stayed with me longer than it should have. The memory of the cabin faded without resistance, the way procedural knowledge fades when it isn't reinforced. I remembered the idea of it more clearly than any specific detail. A sense of alignment without comfort, motion without rest, continuation without memory. That was the last thing that stayed with me. Some places hold stories because they are built around people. Others hold processes because they are built around conditions. The cabin belonged to the second category. It didn't need to remember who had been there. It didn't need to forget them either. It simply kept working, long after we stopped trying to be part of it. When people ask why we didn't stay longer, I never know how to answer. Nothing chased us out. Nothing warned us. Nothing even reacted. The cabin kept working the same way it always had. Lights on schedule, systems running, space holding together without acknowledging who was inside. Leaving didn't feel like escape. It felt like stepping out of something that had never included us. What stayed with me wasn't fear. It was the realization that some places don't need people to complete them. They don't remember. They don't forget. They just continue. And somewhere out there, that cabin is still working. exactly the same, whether anyone is inside it or not.